Welcome to the Lecturette video, Power and Political Systems. In this Lecturette video, we plan to explore the basic social elements of power and how power and persuasion are used in fundamental forms of politics at different levels of social organization. To analyze power as both positive in the form of empowerment, but also as destructive in the destructive manifestation of war. Our specific learning objectives for this Lecturette segment on political systems are to define the kinds of political systems that have existed worldwide and determine what their social and economic correlates are, and to determine how states differ from other forms of political organization. For this topic, we do have keywords. The keywords in bold are in the course book glossary, but I've also added some key concepts in all caps that aren't in the book regarding power that are, I think, very important. A section of this particular Lecturette video is dedicated to power, and I've expanded it here in this Lecturette video. There are some discussion questions too I'd like us to think about for our discussion session as well. Discussion one question is, should we decriminalize our laws, make some laws and rules less explicit in our society? That is, drug possession laws, for instance, give broader discretion to judges, question and interrogate CSI-style forensic evidence, which has really put way too many people, innocent people, in jail. And discussion question two, can we discuss the difficulties in defining war? What is the definition used in the textbook and in the lecture? And do they work? For example, in the film Deadbergs, which we'll be looking at a clip of that in our video and web links file, is about war, but is there a war on terror, for instance, or can there be, or a new asset war with Russia? What part of genocide is war? If war doesn't follow specific rules, are there specific rules with holy war like jihad? And should we define peace in these terms, or find peace in these terms as well, and how can we? Well, let's first define political organizations of societies. Elman Service was an anthropologist who lived until 1996, and he listed 4 types or levels of political organization. He started with band organization, which is a social unit with a few to a dozen people with informal leadership who are often mobile or even nomadic foragers. And a good example of these is actually something like Band of Brothers, who were a platoon of men in World War II, led by mostly changing leaders, but with a remarkable solidarity of a few soldiers. And we'll give other examples of tribal societies as well today. But the Band of Brothers was about a platoon, which is about 30 men, interestingly, so it's about the size of a band organization. There are tribal organizations as well, which is a term used to describe a social group in a mid-sized society of a few hundred to a few thousand people with more power available to leaders, like some of the Native American tribes and the charismatic leaders like Sitting Bull or Red Cloud. These leaders are more accurately described as big men or big men, and we'll go over that a little bit later. There's chiefdoms, which are groups from several hundred to several thousands of people with powerful leaders. Usually there's a level of bureaucracy and hierarchically ordered layers of leadership. Now, chiefdoms can get very large indeed. The Huns, for instance, were led under Attila. I would consider that a chiefdom, probably one of the largest chiefdoms that ever existed, of about 1 million Huns in that case. Finally, there's nation states, which are terms used for social units with thousands to millions of people in large bureaucratic societies with power concentrated in explicitly organized institutions and individuals at various levels. Institution, key phrase there. Now, when we talk about modern foragers today, we should point out that all live in nation states and an interlinked world. All foragers now trade with food producers, for instance, and most contemporary hunter-gatherers rely on governments and missionaries. To give you a good example, the San Bushmen of southern Africa now tend cattle for wealthier Bantu rather than foraging independently. Things have changed. Groups like the San can illustrate the links between a foraging economy and other aspects of life in bands. And the Aboriginal Inuit of North America, hunting and fishing by men, were the primary Inuit subsistence strategies and the bitter environment and the cold put them in greater danger. Of course, these are Arctic people. Adult women outnumbered men, and some men had 2 or 3 wives, contributing to prestige but also envy. This is many years ago, though, also foraging bands have a unique way of conflict resolution in these stateless societies. Foragers lacked formal law with trial enforcement, but they had methods of social control for dispute settlement that were particular to their band. Here's the location of where the Inuits still live in these areas of the Arctic North America. You can freeze this video if you want to look at this map a little bit closer. Let's look at tribal societies, tribal cultivators in particular. Tribes typically have a horticultural or pastoral economy and are organized into villages or descent groups. They lack socioeconomic stratification with formal government. Regulatory officials are village heads or big men, descent group leaders, village councils, and pan-tribal associations. I think about some of the larger tribes were the Mayans after their post-classic period after 900. Before then, they would have been considered chiefs and maybe even states. And we'll talk about how tribes can go from states down back to tribes and even bands again. So it's flexible. The organization of society can go from bands all the way up to states and back down to bands. We look at the Roman society, for instance. Now, the Roman society was, of course, an incredible large state society, but by 500, it had devolved back down into tribal communities and even bands. So it is possible to rise to the state level of organizations and go back down to the band level. But horticultural villages are usually small with low population density and open access to strategic sources. Age, gender, and personality, personal traits determine how much respect people receive. Egalitarianism diminishes as village size and population density increase. A good example of tribal cultivators are the Yanomami of Venezuela and Brazil. The position of the village head is achieved. It comes with very limited authority. Now, a village head is a local tribal leader with limited authority. They must lead by example. They're only as good as they are generous to the community in which they lead. They act as a mediator in disputes as well. Now, the big man is a village head, except his authority is regional and he may have influence over more than one village. Big men are common to the South Pacific. They must be generous with people they serve as a temporary regional regulator. A big man among the Kapauka Papuans of Indonesia is known as a Tonowi. A Tonowi is the key political figure with status achieved through hard work and amassed wealth in the form of pigs and native riches, distinguished by generosity, eloquence, bravery, physical fitness, and supernatural powers. His decisions are accepted as binding. Here's a map of where the Kapauka live in western Indonesia. Now, there are pan-tribal sodalities. A sodality is basically an association. So pan-tribal sodalities are groups that extend across a whole tribe spanning several villages, and the best examples come from the Central Plains of North America and from tropical Africa. Among the plain tribes, leadership was needed to successfully raid enemy camps and manage the summer bison hunt. So these are tribes that get together as a larger association, a mega tribe, so to speak. Among the pastoral Maasai of Kenya, men born during the same 4-year period were circumcised together and belonged to the same name group and age set throughout their lives. Sets moved through age grades. The warrior grade was the most important. In parts of Western and Central Africa, pan-tribal societies are secret societies exclusively for men or women. Nomads must interact with a variety of groups, unlike most sedentary societies. So nomadic tribes and chiefs. Chiefs are common in nomadic tribes. Powerful chiefs are commonly found in these groups who have larger populations, like the Kashki and the Basari of Iran. The Basari have a smaller population. The chief is known there as a Khan, similar to a village head with a larger population. The position is achieved and allegiances are with the person. And large kashki have multiple levels of authority, and more powerful chiefs. Authority can be more coercive, and allegiances are with the office. Here is a location in southern Iran of the Basari and the Kashki, and some pictures of the Kashki. They're pastoral nomads, like I said, traditionally trekked about 300 miles from highland summer pastures to lowland winter pastures near the Persian Gulf. The traditional migration is shown on the left. The modern trek incorporating motor vehicles is on the right. Chiefdoms are mainly a transitional form of socio-political organization between tribes and states, and the early states are known as archaic or non-industrial. Rabocaneiro states that the state is an autonomous political unit encompassing many communities within its territory, having a centralized government within the power to collect taxes, draft men for work or war, and decree and enforce laws. Now, chiefdom and states are ideal types, labels that make social contrasts seem sharper. In chiefdoms, social relations are based on kinship, marriage, descent, age, generation, and gender. Chiefdoms administer a clear-cut and permanent regional political system. There's an office. It's a permanent position that must be refilled when it is vacated by death or retirement. Offices generally outlast individuals. They can be inherited. Offices ensure that the socio-political organization endures across generations. Chiefs play an important role in the production, distribution, and consumption of resources as well. They collect foodstuff as tribute and redistribute. We learned about that last week. Redistribute collected foodstuff such as feasts, a practice known as chiefly redistribution. Max Weber defines 3 dimensions of social stratification. Economic status or wealth, a person's material assets, the basis of his or her economic status. Power, the ability to control others, the basis of political status. And prestige, finally, the esteem, respect, or approval, the basis of social status. Archaic states had contrasts in wealth, power, and prestige as well. We had one upper class, the superordinate, upper elite group in a stratified society, privileged access to wealth, power, and valued resources. And we had the lower class, the subordinate class, underprivileged group in a stratified society limited by the privileged group. States are autonomous political units with social strata and a formal government. States tend to be a large and populous. Certain statuses, systems, and subsystems are found in all states. Population control, a judiciary, enforcement, and fiscal support. State control population through administration subdivisions, districts, states, counties, sub-counties, and parishes. They often promote geographic mobility and resettlement. There are different rights assigned to different status and distinctions. And states have laws based on precedent and legislative proclamations. All states have courts and judges. Law is unique in that it intervenes in family affairs, and states attempt to curb internal conflict. Now, states have social controls, which are defined as the fields of the social systems, beliefs, practices, and institutions that are most actively involved in the maintenance of norms and regulation of conflict. Norms enable individuals to distinguish appropriate and inappropriate behavior. We've had norms in our society for a very long time. Many of them come from the Judeo-Christian template in our much older past in the West here. And political systems have informal, social, and subtle aspects along with formal government and public dimensions. A really important word for us to realize about states is hegemony. Now, hegemony is the idea that subordinates only comply with rulers' values by accepting the naturalness of domination. There is an implied consent of the masses for consenting for this domination of some sense. Subordinates believe they will eventually gain power. It's one of the ways consent is achieved. Separate or isolate people while supervising them closely is one of the other goals of hegemonic powers. Now, what happens with this hegemony as well is that there's resistance, and resistance is most likely when people are allowed to assemble and contest these norms and hegemony imposed upon them by state powers. This is also a good time to take a short break in the video lecturette. Specific learning objectives for this lecturette segment on power are to scrutinize different forms of power differentials, to interrogate the idea of social control, cultural postulates, and the elemental definitions of law and order and how it is established and maintained in various societies, to try and understand the fundamental basis of war, its causes and its nature, and to come to some possible solutions for achieving peace. Now, it's important to understand when we look at social controls that social controls are basically laws, and they come from some basic cultural postulates. Laws have meaning because they are based on culture. And to understand laws, one must understand the basic ethical and moral understanding of a society. Cultural postulates can be derived from a total body of religious and moral texts. I mean, if we look at the last 5 commandments of the Old Testament, for instance, we look at thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. In other words, lie in court, falsify evidence, thou shalt not covet. A lot of these have been incorporated into the Western system of law. And the system of law basically is created to establish culturally acceptable behavior or norms, to define the transgressions of this behavior, and to develop the means and guidelines to resolve such transgressions. And let's talk about this a little bit. Laws are the most effective means to limit the harmful effects of discrimination as well. Do you believe in affirmative action and laws being incorporated to create more egalitarian society? Now, there is a continuum of cultural norms, and laws are the most formal range of cultural rules of behavior, rules and ideas and postulates. There are some very explicit social controls that we have, which are formal and written codes, absolute rules, and prescriptions. There's also some implicit rules, verbal rules, unwritten rules, rules dependent on circumstances. And we should think about this in some other ways. I mean, here's one way of presenting the difference between explicit and implicit rules. Are red lights interpretive? When should explicit rules be more nuanced and implicit? When the street intersection that you're in, let's say, you're driving down the road, you've got a red light, and there's nobody in the area whatsoever. You can see in all directions for miles. Do you sit there and wait for that red light to come to green to go forward through the red light? Have you ever just pulled through that red light and wondered why that explicit rule, that where you can clearly see safely that you can cross across the street, do you ever just go across the street with your car and wonder why you haven't before? If you have transgressions, are acceptable deviations in behavior from cultural rules of behavior, are unacceptable deviations rather. Crimes can be remedied by torts, wrongs against an individual that are remedied by actions pursued by an individual through the court system and civil suits. Power can be very differential in state systems as well as chief systems as well. In state systems, sometimes you have slavery and serfdom and even indentured servitude, just a few English terms that have been used to describe conditions of extreme power differentials, extreme servitude. The institution of slavery can be defined as an extreme exercise of power over individuals sanctified by a society. And quite often, in our recent past, slavery was a condition also of colonialism, which is the total control over another state. And the colonization of other states has been occurring as far back as our historical resources have recorded. In the conditions of extreme power differentials, often you find oppression. And this may seem, oppressed may seem to accept their domination by a dominant class, even as they question it in private. And so this has led to some really interesting work and research by James Scott, who has said that when a segment of the population is oppressed, they can exhibit their feelings in 2 different ways: through public transcript, the open public interactions between oppressed people and their oppressors. In other words, if we go to basically do a demonstration or something like that, an open active resistance to what's going on. There's also this thing called hidden transcript, which is critiquing power off stage where the power holders can't see it. It's kind of like the things that you say under your breath to your boss, between your employees. And it's not out in the open. The important thing here is that hidden transcript can become public transcript very quickly, can fluoresce that way. Discontent may be expressed in public rituals and language in public transcript. Hidden transcripts tend to be expressed publicly at certain times and only in certain places. Modern social media has played a role in various political movements, and we'll talk about this in our final topic. Protests against the Brazilian government use Facebook as well as internet and television news, and although media can disseminate political goals and spur action, social media cannot guarantee change. Here's a clip of public demonstrations in Brazil. Now, in small-scale societies, conflict resolution is often resolved through mediation, which refers to systems that are less formal, involve less institutionalized power, and are aimed at reconciliation of the opposed parties. For instance, the solution for stealing pigs in Dani society. Now, adjudication is a mediation where a third party is appointed who has the power to impose judgment on the disputing parties. And this is really, you can see a really good example of this in the causa dolo Kenpai, resolving conflict among the Capelli. Conflict resolution in modern industrial societies is a relatively new subdiscipline called legal anthropology. And it's begun to look at the adjudication practices around the world and the power embedded in cultural values and magisterial systems which administer laws and penalties. Adjudication and mediation are both used in state societies as well as tribal societies. Here is the worldwide incarceration rates, and I have a link to this in the video and web links files that's updated. I'd like to talk to you about this during our discussion session and ask, should we decriminalize our laws, make some laws and rules less explicit in our society, like drug possession, DUI laws, etc., give broader discretion to judges, and question and interrogate forensic evidence that has put a lot of innocent people in jail. So let's look at these incarceration rates and talk about them later. Now, sometimes war breaks out in the cases of transgressions where conflict occurs between large groups of people. Conflict often becomes war. The causes of war are embedded in rationalizations for the transgression of universal cultural rules across societies. Causes of war also can be attributable to the imposition of explicit rules of behavior and ideology by a superordinate society that are not accepted by subordinate societies. The nature of war is universal. War is a male-dominated endeavor. Wars produce homicide. And ironically, wars generally have rules, though violence does not necessarily. And we'll have to talk about this a little bit more again during our discussion session. Now, a lasting peace requires continuing research on conflict resolution, more cultural, psychosocial research, and identifying the structural components of continuously at-war regions and societies. For instance, Afghanistan, where the combination of historical colonial factors and political factors have radicalized and misrepresented religious zealotry there. And there is enduring conflict resolution, I think, also requires less oppression, both economical and political. So much of what we think of as ethnic conflict today is really about economical disenfranchisement of one part of the society. And so if we have less oppression economically and politically of one sector of the society, we can, I think, we can open up the public transcripts of what we see in society. We have to be in the West more cognizant of oppression where it is around the world. The hidden transcript is what we need to look at before it becomes public transcript in areas of the world. Peace seems to be ephemeral, lasting a short time in global society. Just when we think there's lasting peace, there's a breakout of war and conflict. Again, I believe, though, that this is because we aren't reading the signs of oppression, the hidden transcript, and the fluorescence and flowering of conflict because of this. I also don't think there's any doubt anymore that states have manipulated war and peace. A new book has come out about the brothers, John Foster Dulles and Alan Dulles and their secret world war during the Cold War era of 1948 to 1960 during the Eisenhower administration. This book relies on CIA documents that have become open source documents now. It really tells the story of how America from 48 to 60 really engaged in changing governments around the world to put in some very corrupt dictators that could kowtow to American empire's policy. And we really destabilized the world for generations after that. And we'll have to talk about this some more during our discussion session as well. I'm not going to read what the Brothers Dulles is about, but I have this slide here. If you want to read that, freeze the video and read about it so that we can get back to it in our discussion. That would be great. We're reading some very interesting articles this week to The Case of an American Gypsy and Conformity and Conflict by ANTH. And if you want to freeze the video here too and read an abstract of the article, that would be great to give you some background. But this article looks at what happens when members of one culture live under the legal jurisdiction of another. And the article describes the case of a young gypsy man accused of using someone else's social security number and the role played by an anthropologist in his court defense. So the young gypsy male used the social security number of a 5-year-old nephew to apply for a car loan. The only thing is this is not accepted in America, but it is accepted with gypsies as a cultural construct. And this is what happens where there's a collision basically between cultures and law and order. We're also looking at the article Law and Order in Conformity and Conflict. Now in this article, Spradley and McCurdy present law in the context of dispute resolution using cases drawn from an anthropologist, Laura Nader's work in Araua, a Zapotec Indian village located in southern Mexico. The article deals with several concepts: the structure of legal culture, including substantive law and procedural law, and legal levels in southern Mexico. And the article illustrates the flirtation of a married man with an unmarried woman, which the Zapotec treat as a crime, believe it or not. Similarly, the case of a son who has harvested coffee from his father's land without permission is also defined as a crime to be dealt with by the community's legal system. Now, the Zapotec have a different idea of what constitutes a vice and a crime than we do, and we're going to need to talk about this during our discussion session. If you want to freeze the Lecturette video here and read the full abstract of this article, that would be great. So much has been written about peace, war, and the influence of tradition, and talked about in modern day society. And we've historically looked at the Crusades and the wars fought in the name of Christ in defense of Christian theology. But we have also looked at recently the spate of Islamic terrorism that has happened and occurred around the world. And I want to present to you a different take on religions. And I've got two websites here I'd like to talk to us about. When we think about Christianity, one thing to think about, I think, is that certainly there have been wars in the name of Christ, but again, with religions, the universal message of most religion is peaceful coexistence. And if we look at Christianity, the question is not how many people have died in the name of wars for Christianity. Maybe another question, or that is a good question, but another question might be how many people have been saved by Christianity. And I'll give you some examples of that as well. We also, when we look at Muslims right now and Islam, we don't acknowledge, I think, that the vast majority of Islamic people are living a peaceful coexistence. And one such organization we can look at is Muslims for Peace, an organization dedicated to interfaith coexistence, dialogue, and peace. So I'd like you to look at that particular website and the Amazon website for this book, where 50 theologians, peace activists, and military experts, public policy analysts, and media commentators gather together, discuss what war really is and how the theory applies to the war in Iraq. And we'll conclude there and talk about this soon.